Welcome to Walking Through Worlds, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we're recording this on, and also the place and space that our guest is also on. So in particular, the Turrbal and the Yuggera people of this land, also known as Meanjin or Brisbane. We pay our respects to all the elders, past and present, and we acknowledge also the Palawa people, of which the land that our guest Nick Brodie is on, down in Tasmania. And, we acknowledge all the First Nations people from Australian Aboriginals to Torres Strait Islanders. So welcome Nick Brodie, our historian, archaeologist and writer. I know on your bios you quite openly say you're a history nerd. I've read two of your books and you have quite a number of books. Nick is the last one, I think, was Under Fire. Is that the last one you released?
Yeah, that's the last big
last
one.
one's Under Fire. Before that, there was Kosciuszko. There's the Vandemonian War, which we're going to talk about, and the popular one, 1787, about pre-European settlement. I love that. You also wrote about a real people's history of our nation called Kin. And did I miss any then? No, that's it.
No, you've got the main ones now.
And then there's some early ones you did. And also we're going to touch on things like the frontier wars, particularly around the book Vandemonian War. So welcome, Nick.
G'day, Greg. Thanks for having me.
No, I really look forward to this conversation. Nick and I haven't had too much to do with each other, and I stumbled across Nick's work in the library. No, I think I went out and bought the Vandemonian War, so I'll be honest, I purchased that one. Then I went to the library and I found 1787. It jumped out at me, and hence I'm excited to talk to Nick and allow our listeners to sort of explore the works that Nick's doing as a historian. But for the listeners, you can sort of give us a bit of an overview of Tasmania. You weren't born there, you came from New South Wales. How long's your family been in Australia? Where did they come from initially?
Yep. Okay. So, the first book, Kin, is essentially the history of Australia as told through my family history. And so I tracked back into the 1790s with convicts arriving in New South Wales. And in broad brushstrokes, basically the eastern states of mainland Australia are where my people arrived, settled, and spread. And so that's sort of my background, with a passing brief encounter in Tasmania. My people are not Tasmanian people in any way, shape or form, but they were here for a crucial week to see things happening on their way to the mainland. So I grew up in country New South Wales in a little town called Junee near Wagga Wagga. I then went and studied at Canberra at the ANU and came down here to Tasmania to actually do a PhD in 16th century English law for the regulation of beggary, vagabondage and poor relief in England. And it was while being here and doing that I got much more interested in Australian history properly, really, if I'm honest. Up until that point, I was very much a classical medieval history nerd, focused on what was happening overseas. But being in Tasmania, it really started to get me interested in the Australian story, the Tasmanian story specifically, but Australia more broadly. And so when I finished the PhD, I transited to writing Australian history, both in a really scholarly way, so writing technical papers for fellow historians, but also trying to write those sorts of books that will get out there beyond the ivory towers into the laps of the wider reading public.
So the Vandemonian Wars, which I really got a lot out of that, because it sort of gives you this very detailed account from different perspectives even, and a really deep research into the first arrivals and their sort of encounters, their real encounters with First Nations people. Because as I was growing up in Tasmania, we'd go to the Hobart Museum, we'd walk through and see a big mannequin statue of the last of the full-blooded Aboriginals, I think they called it, Truganini. And, a few of my closer First Nations people now tell me that that's a bit of a myth. It's not a truism anymore. Not in today. There's a lot more about the First Nations people who actually were able to escape and sort of live quite comfortably. I'm not sure. Did you research any of that? What happened after Truganini?
Really my entry into this whole Tasmanian history is through what I like to think of as the problematic master narrative of the Black War. And I got really interested in the way that history is told in Tasmania, and blatant, demonstrable myths and untruths have persisted as ways of telling history. And the first instance of that was actually a little study I did of a window in a church in a little town called Buckland on the east coast of Tasmania. And I arrived doing this medieval PhD hearing that there was this medieval window in a church in Tasmania. And it's in all the brochures and it's in a couple of the books. And so I thought, well, I've got to check this out. And I did go and have a look. And obviously, as soon as I walked through the door, you can see it's a 19th century window. It's not a medieval window. But there is this story that this window was from Battle Abbey in Hastings, which at the time of the dissolution of the monasteries was buried underground, and a couple of hundred years later was dug up, transported to Tasmania and installed in this window. And it's so ludicrous. It took me maybe half a day's research to find the original letter from the first priest asking the glaziers in Europe to specifically make that window for his church. So we can demonstrate really easily that it's not a medieval window. But I'm fascinated by the way that stories like that in Tasmania really endure. Yes. Despite the wealth of evidence, people choose to keep telling the same old stories no matter how ludicrous they sound. And so having done that and then working in research and teaching, and I was teaching a course on frontier conflict in Tasmania at the time in Burnie on the north of the island. And Tasmania was really prominent in the 1990s and early 2000s in the so-called history wars, when people argued about what happened in Australia generally. And it was quite a bitter sort of argument. And that's part of what drove me away from Australian history, because I thought it was so navel-gazingly silly, in the sense that if you approach the process and the evidence with a professional mindset, you can reach truths. You know, I disagree entirely that the world is entirely perspective. You know, perspectives are a way of juggling the path towards some sort of reasonable assessment of truth and historical truth, and that's what historians are trained to do. And so I just thought, well, the Australians are all fixated on arguing about meaning and they don't get into the core detail. But once I'd reached that point where I was teaching it, and I'd had that experience of undoing a really easy to undo myth in Tasmanian history, albeit quite local, to do with a window and a funny story, I used the same processes and started to apply them to Tasmanian frontier history. Because when I asked my students to look for the resources in the footnotes of some of the resources that they were reading, they couldn't find them. There was a particular newspaper which had been cited, and I had the students on Trove, the repository of digitised newspapers, which is now at our fingertips, and they could not find the newspaper, they could not find the story. You know, this historian had told a story which was demonstrably untrue, in the sense that the evidence they were citing for it did not exist. And so I became interested in how that story endured, where the evidence really was, and working out what had really happened. And so with a bit of legwork, I was able to track down the origin of this story, which concerned a woman defending her hut against Aboriginal attackers by shooting them with a duck gun. And I could track it back through a novel, to a manuscript story, to an early published account. And that started to get me thinking really about the way that there is this Black War master narrative in Tasmania, where people tell strange stories that don't always have a basis in evidence, but by repetition they attract gravitas, and therefore they get told again and again. And so over a number of years, and the Vandemonian War is the biggest expression of that, I have gone deep into the archive to find the actual evidence of what was happening in Tasmania, but also matching that with a close study of how different sources and stories emerged later and other ones declined. And to give you just the broadest way of understanding that, What happened in the 1820s and 1830s in Tasmania was very brutal, and the government was very involved in what was happening, directing it and covering it up. A generation later, the descendants and children and older people who had participated in that process started to turn it into a narrative history, much in the same way that people did with World War I in the last 20, 30 years. And so they start to tell stories about it, and people start to write histories. And this basically takes place from the 1870s onwards. And so there is this big gap between what the evidence actually said happened and the way people talked about it a generation after the fact. And it's that second one, it's that way people talked about it after the fact, which has persisted in this Black War narrative. And that narrative is one where basically the conflict was a vague, distant thing happening on the frontier beyond the gaze of government, where mostly nasty convict servant stockmen were attacking Aboriginal people and they were retaliating. And eventually it was out of control. The government couldn't do anything until ultimately they sent a peacemaker in the form of George Augustus Robinson and his so-called friendly mission, and invited the Aboriginal people to submit themselves to government, in which case they were then taken to Wi3W exile in the islands. But that's a very nice politicized view of the conflict, because it basically puts fault on the convicts rather than the settlers and the government, and it makes it seem like the Aboriginal people were reconciled peacefully with the government at the time, whereas it's anything but the fact. Until I looked in the archives, nobody knew that at the same time that George Augustus Robinson was going to the northeast of Tasmania, for instance, the government was arming and equipping a team led by an ex-soldier with a promise of reward for capturing Aboriginal people, where the governor actually said that if you kill people during the course of capture, you will still get the reward. So there's a real hammer and anvil thing going on in Van Diemen's Land at that time. It was very brutal, but that sort of stuff never makes it into the public. No,
narrative. And also, I think I recall reading in that book that you said they were bringing people, First Nations people from Sydney town, to come and actually work with the settlers. Is that right? Did I read that right?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. There's this whole complex phenomenon of what I term in the book Aboriginal auxiliaries, which is quite a catch-all term because there are different types. Some of the most prominent are what are called, in the language of the time, Sydney natives, which is merely because they come from New South Wales. They're not necessarily Sydney people at all, but they're mainland Aboriginal people who are coming and assisting John Batman, who's quite a prominent, notorious mercenary settler of Van Diemen's Land and later Port Phillip district, Melbourne. And so he is using these people as trackers, effectively, to help him move through the bush and more effectively hunt down the Aboriginal people that he is after. You also have this process whereby when Aboriginal people are captured by the colonial authorities, they will often attach some of these captives to subsequent missions. Some of these are slightly older men or women, but often it's children as well. So they've got really kids that they're forcing to go on these missions to help them track fellow Aboriginal people. And you can see some of the tensions of Aboriginal society come out there, where the settlers and convicts who are on these missions get the distinct impression that they're being given a bit of a bum steer by these kids. And I mean, that's a really brave thing to do when you think about it, to take a whole armed colonial unit away from the people that they're hunting. So it's really quite a mix of Aboriginal people involved, in inverted commas, on the colonial side.
So with the Black Wars, was there a known leader amongst the First Nations people, like a warrior? Were there any sort of written documents around the braveness of them to sort of try to resist this coming of the Europeans and the settling? Yeah,
there are several figures who are quite prominent, and it varies. So these days, people often point to Manalagenna as a major leader, but that's probably got more to do with the fact that he is the major line of descent and one of those who outlasted others. In the period that I was writing about, the government is fixated on the figure of Umara, who is a difficult sort of character. He in some ways seems to be playing the government. He submits himself to their capture and then guides their missions, but scarpers off a couple of times and just deserts them. So he's playing the government as much as they think they might be playing him. The brutality of the conflict ultimately shows both sides fighting very fiercely over territory. So in that sense, Aboriginal people, Aboriginal warriors in Tasmania are very bravely fighting for their country. But in some cases, I think that does turn to replicate the brutality of the colonial forces. It's cycles of very localized, very heated violence. Obviously gets out of control almost in a Balkans sort of
And
way.
have you seen that that living document that lady produced out of the University of, I think it was Newcastle, and it shows you the different massacres and genocides across Australia over a period of 100 years, from the 1820s right up to the 1930s, sort of thing, 110 years. Have you seen it?
I'm aware of that, but that lady who's produced that is the one who wrote the article, which I got the students to look for the evidence, which they couldn't find.
That's interesting.
I have a cynical eye to that. I think it's not a bad idea, but I worry very much about the execution of those sorts of projects, because if you turn it into an exercise about massacre, as in individual instances of violence, then the threshold of evidence is that much higher. You have to be able to say for sure that this happened, or someone else will be able to come across and find evidence to the contrary and prove you wrong. And that gives fuel to the idea that settlement was peaceful. To my mind, it's much more useful to look at the bigger structural issues, as in what the government knew, what the government said to do. Because an instruction, whether it's carried out or not, tells you a hell of a lot about the way governments were thinking. The test of genocide is not how many people you kill, it's how many people you are willing to kill or intend to kill. And so in that respect, I think those sorts of projects are a double-edged sword, and I've sort of kept myself at a distance from that because of that. And
this is the interesting thing, as part of the healing, for the listeners that don't know, I mentioned this to you earlier, that I am of Tasmanian stock, but that occurred through my convict great-great-grandmother 6 generations ago in 1789, came out on a boat with 225 women. They landed at Port Jackson, and obviously at that time they came, it was probably a year after the first fleet, they were quite starving. They were starving of food. They sent the boat away, and they boarded another boat and went to Norfolk Island. So they stayed at Norfolk Island until about 1808. And I believe that they came down to Van Diemen's Land. She by then was a free settler. She went with another man, my surname being Dodge. He'd already run off to Hawkesbury River, given her 3 children, met another man, and they went back to Hobart Town and started down there around Carlton, Port Sorell on the eastern shore. And the interesting connection there was in your book, in the Vandemonian Wars, in the back is the mention of Dodge, my surname. And Ralph Dodge was the son of the convict woman, Charlotte Simpson, of which I've written a poem, which is on our podcast series and episodes. And I sort of cover in there as a way of acknowledging that he was instructed. And I was trying to piece this together without any documentation, but just sort of, I suppose, trying to piece together what could have occurred. He has no knowledge of Britain. He has no connection with, the homeland at all. His mother is a convict woman whose father has already run away. There's a new man in her life, giving her another 5 children. He's about 18. The government gives him 150 hectares or, a large portion of land to turn into farming. Now, he's probably got no farming skills. He may have picked up a little bit at Norfolk Island where they were growing produce. He's in Tassie. He's in that area around Carlton. And he then, about 10 or 15 years later, he purchased another chunk of land, and that property becomes Lagoon Farm, which is there is a historical society that I've discovered, and I've tried to reach out to them, and I'd love to explore this. And he set up Dodges Ferry. So he would row a boat from that place around Carlton out to Midway Point, so that the military or the settlers that were going to Hobart Town, it was sort of a halfway point. It saved them going the long way around. It was sort of a way to get across, and that became, and still is, a suburb today called Dodges Ferry. But I think back, he really had no concept probably of even, in terms of, he's a white settler, mum's a convict, dad's run off, she's got a new man, a new family, I've been given land, and the government come and say, look, we want to clear the land. Can you come and join us on this line, the black line, and let's go across and sweep the area for what they call their natives. And he probably said, sure, where do I sign up? You've given me land. I sort of owe the Queen something in return. Now, in your book, you don't say, you haven't found evidence that he was part of that particular massacre or genocide or, black wars or anything, but he is mentioned in the book. So you've obviously stumbled across him in your paperwork as one of the settlers who is working quite willing with the government.
Yeah, well, I could tell you how to find out if he was on that line, because one of the, I think, most chilling aspects of the general movement, as it was called, was, so this is basically the government had increasingly sent out military parties, armed convict field police, and what I call mercenary settlers, so those are settlers who were promised land grants and reward, to capture or push Aboriginal people off country. That's the government's ultimate goal is get Aboriginal people off country to facilitate settlement, stop them transiting through what are called the settled districts. And the settled districts are really just called the settled districts. At the time we're talking about, they're not in any way, shape or form
about Port Arthur,
widely settled.
Just places of...
Port Arthur doesn't exist at this moment, actually. This is the moment that Port Arthur's actually just being settled in 1830, that the general movement starts. So the government gets as many soldiers as it can out in the field, as many of these mercenary settlers and convict field police, and supplements that by these militia, getting as many settlers, convicts, servants as they can to go out and provide supplementary force to this endeavour. It's not really a single line that walks across the island. What really happens is there's a series of push and reform movements where they drive forward almost as if you're driving cattle or sheep in a big series of movements. And then after driving through much of the Midlands of southern Tasmania, they halt and they basically make a fortified line about 60 kilometres long, which they hold for a couple of weeks to contain Aboriginal people in the peninsula. And while they're doing that, they send these secret skirmish parties out in front. And they're the ones who capture too. And when you look at the whole thing, there's a lot of talk about it being a fiasco and disaster and didn't achieve its goals and so on. But I think there's probably a bit of mythology around that, because we have very little documentation for what took place in the largest military operation on Australian soil. We do not know anything about the micro details of the soldiery, who are the mainstay of the line. We have the top level instructions basically on a day-to-day level about where to go. And we know that skirmish parties were going out in front. We know that a huge volume of ammunition was being expended at various points, including when the line was being held. And we know that people were shooting at Aboriginal people willy-nilly. We also know that in the entirety of the conflict, there is no real coronial inquest into Aboriginal people when they are killed. So when we do know that Aboriginal people are killed, that often doesn't generate much in the way of a paper trail. So I'm very suspicious of this whole idea that the line was a mistake and that it failed to achieve its objectives. If its objectives were to remove Aboriginal people from that country, it was relatively successful in the sense that while the conflict did persist for a couple of years, it certainly was in a diminishing way, and the number of people captured in the end when the conflict was finally brought to a halt were very small. And from that whole operation, while we don't have the details, we don't know, cases where groups of soldiers may have encountered an Aboriginal group and fired upon them, for instance. What we do have is the administrative aftermath. We have pages and pages and pages of manuscripts which have lists of names and the numbers of rounds of ammunition which were given to them during the re-equipping phase as the reserves came through. And so on those lists, we can see the names of individual settlers and their servants who are participating in this on the behalf of government. So in the case of a Dodge, for instance, it would be possible, if they're in the right unit for which these things survive, to actually have their names. They're one of the most chilling untapped genealogical resources in Australian history, really. We're talking hundreds of names of people, and these names are names that are still very common in Tasmania, which is perhaps the reason this resource hasn't really emerged into much public light and discussion. But they are there. They're in the archives.
And I think these sort of discussions are about reaching back into that past, acknowledging these things existed. Because I think part of the people that I know, First Nations, the traditional custodians up here in Queensland in areas I've met, it's more about truth-telling and truth listening. It's sharing the stories to each other. I mean, we can't change that past. If it's all documented, you can't change what's occurred. It's horrific. We also know, as we've explored on our podcast, it occurred 2,000 years ago with the Romans, invading the Brittany. Was the same type of activity from the Romans. Dominance, governance. Clear the land. Get rid of the language. This is something that humanity tends to do historically. With an oppressor who comes in and wants that land.
I think it's very useful in Australia for people to think in those terms, actually, in terms of the Roman occupations. The term colony comes from colonia, which is the Roman soldier settlement. Now, in Van Diemen's Land, for instance, the government very aggressively encouraged former soldiers to settle in Tasmania. And the reason is because you have a ready-made, trained fighting force should you need it.
And some of them probably came from the Americas, I assume. There were 13 penal colonies in America at that time. Remember, just before the war, and Britain's focus to resettle a whole new penal colony, my understanding is that it could have been anywhere. It just happened that this gentleman, James Cook, had ventured down here and explored and, uncovered this east coast of a continent, which was not known prior to that. And that gets into the 1787, your book 1787. That's phenomenal to go back and trace nearly 300 years of Eurasian sort of venturing around. Look, as an Australian, I went up to Western Australia a couple of years ago, caravanning, and we ended Sharks Bay, I think it was. And there's a little plaque there in the middle of the road, 1606, Dirk Hartog, And I was a bit shocked. I didn't know. My wife had done it, had done the history at school. But in my growing up in Tasmania, we never knew that the Dutch had sort of made land there in 1606. And I read in your book about 1616 being a real impact time for the Dutch. But then, going back to Tasmania, the Van Diemen's Land and its history, it was already sort of documented through, Abel Tasman and, that whole period. So it was a known island, but not really sure, I think, how it was connected. And New Zealand and Norfolk Island and all that connection with New South Wales and, that little microcosm of time where New Zealand is part of New South Wales. And I don't think a lot of people understand that even that could have been just another state of Australia, potentially.
Yeah, I think we in Australia suffer from a problem of aggressive historical parochialism. And that's what 1787 was in part about addressing. It's about putting Australia back in a wider regional context. I like to think, obviously, the European voyagers were explorers in the sense that from the European perspective, they were exploring the world. But I think from an Australian perspective, it's very handy to talk about them as having encounters. It's the encounters with Indigenous people in Australia, New Guinea, New Zealand, that you can use to tell the history of what is happening in this place in a global sense, in that big, broad, macro way. And what happens is, from the 17th century onwards, Australia does have increasing contact with the rest of the world, especially in Northern Australia. And then in Southeastern Australia, in the lead up to British permanent occupation at Port Jackson in 1788, there is this whole process of what I referred to as campsite colonialism, rocking up and repeatedly coming up to the same spot to use it as basically a naval base for British operations in the Pacific. New Zealand is the place of where that happens most, but Tasmania to a considerable degree as well is part of that world. In a funny way, Port Jackson's the outlier. It's the one which only gets visited once and then permanent occupation takes place. And it's the beachhead for the invasion of mainland Australia, clearly. But there is this process leading up to that, which I think is really interesting, which shows the imperial powers of Europe familiarising themselves with this region, to an extent familiarising themselves with the people, although when you look at it closely, what you can see is that there's actually a process of prejudice build-up, you might like to think of it, where early descriptions which belong to the 17th century and the 17th century way of the world are very clearly informing the way that people like Cook saw Aboriginal people when he encountered them. They're vastly different people in terms of place, time and behaviour, but they all sort of get lumped together. And so what you see there is the emergence of this notion that all Aboriginal people are the same. And that forms during those years before the British have even started to arrive.
And that's where the ignorance, to a large degree, of not, as we discover from Aboriginal people, their languages and their culture was like really coming to Africa or Europe itself. There were so many different cultural rituals and ceremonies that differed. Tasmania had no relationship to, the North, as we know, Northern Territory today, or Queensland and West Australia. There was a lot of intermingling, we know, of different mobs and tribes, but broadly speaking, a lot of them wouldn't have even been aware of a lot of the others in other spaces and places.
Yeah, exactly. But by the time the British arrived, they've got a very firm idea that they're all much the same.
And that's what they used. They used the power of that to be able to drop one mob into another mob who had no connection. There was nothing. There was no relationship at all. There was no kinship there whatsoever. So they could use one possibly to help them, move their cause forward, to clear the land and so on. And obviously, when I read about, the sheep and cattle being the First Nations people pretty quickly in certain areas, identify that that's a source of nourishment and economic benefit. That's what the settlers were bringing. So they'd attack them deliberately. So they weren't attacking the settlers per se, but the settlers would take that as a right to go out and then look for these people, and then sort of use that as, they came and killed our sheep and cattle, therefore we have the right to kill their families, Now, Ray Kirkhope is a historian up in Queensland, here in southeast Queensland, and he spends most of his time researching the frontier wars here. So I'm going to connect you to we'll be interviewing Ray at some point. He wrote a book called the Battle of One Tree Hill, and it's about basically the resistance movement around from Darling Downs up to Gympie, around the Moreton Bay area, and over 3,000 warriors that he's been able to sort of acknowledge, and they held off the settlers coming up from Brisbane town going north for 4 years. And I just found that astounding, because as he was explaining that, think about the Japanese, they entered World War II for about 3 years, and here were these warriors that were very strong in their resistance movement. So I think all of these histories are worth for people to explore. And if you explore your books, the Vandemonian War, overlay that with what Ray's doing, overlay it with a lot of the books that are now readily available for people to educate themselves and become less tied to the old narrative and start to see the newer narrative, which is, who are we as Australians? Because all those stories of who we are together weave the national story, and if we just have the European side of the story, we're missing 65,000 plus years of incredible cultural rich history of this continent that we're part of now, that we share. And I think First Nations people that I've spoken to really want that to occur. There's not that sort of, oh, you all need to go and leave the land, you came here and destroyed us. There's none of that. They're like, okay, now, here we are, today in 2021. How do we move this forward? And there's been enough sort of government and institutional recognition of the trauma and the generational trauma and damage that they've done to the First Peoples of the land. So many. Paul Keating, 1992, the Paul Keating Redfern speech acknowledging that they brought the disease and the alcohol and did the damage, and the churches that have all acknowledged what they've done through the missionaries and through taking people away and putting them and splitting up families and the stolen generation. There's all that's documented there for people to see, but it's still in a young phase of opening up for everyone to go, you know what, we have to heal it. It's time. These stories must be told. And in America, Ray Kirchhoff was saying, in America, when the American Indians, they've now plotted where a lot of the battles and skirmishes have occurred over there for 200 years. And in Australia, we're only just aware of these skirmishes and starting to get the documentation so that we can actually acknowledge it and even have memorials there in the places and spaces for people to understand the two sides of that history, not just a one-sided history.
Yeah, I think we are in a really interesting phase, and we're in a very early phase. It's easy to think that this has been going on for a long time. One of my bugbears really is that those master narratives persist so firmly in the public consciousness. They're so easy to debunk. They're like a medieval window, which is clearly not a medieval window. And one, the Tasmanian example that I'll give is, you will never hear me refer anymore to the Black War. The idea of the Black War, to me, is bizarre. In New Zealand, they now talk about the New Zealand land wars. They don't talk about the Maori wars. In South Africa, it's the South African, it's the English colonial wars. So
it's reframing. Like it's reframing the words.
It's not the Kaffir wars, yeah. Whereas in Australia, we're still stuck to that idea of referring to things like the Black War, the idea that it was the war against the blacks. And it was far more complex than that. And it was part of our broader national history. In Tasmania, if you don't want to call it the Vandemonian War, then call it the Tasmanian War or the Midlands War. Pretty much anything other than the Black War would be a step forward. And the same is true in mainland Australia. We need to see these things not just as little kangaroo fights that take place here and there now and then, and we shouldn't see it as a wave of massacre. It's a wave of conflict, and there are a series of regional conflicts, some smaller than others, some huge, some last for years, some last for days. But until we change the way we think about it as part of our history of colonial war, and I think that's probably the most useful term, is that these are Australia's colonial wars. They are the wars which facilitated colonisation. And that's just part of our story. There are different results of that. There can be different perspectives about elements of that. But the thing itself is just a fact. It's just a fact of Australian history, which is why in every single book that I've written, at some point or other, I'm dealing with a colonial war. And they're not a frontier war in the sense that they're out in the distant front.
That's right.
The term frontier war actually was used in World War One. When we talk about the Western Front and the Eastern Front, that's just a shortened version of the Eastern and Western frontier. So I think we need to reframe the way we talk about these things. It's not just a case of wars between servants and Aboriginal people, or cycles of violence and massacre by settlers. More often than not, once you start to scratch below the surface, you will see the soldiers there. You will see the police there. You will see the police magistrates there. You will see the structures of government in these conflicts. So it is Aboriginal people defending themselves against a colonial aggressor and a colonial invader. That's just a fact of history. But so long as we keep using the language of sort of late 19th century antiquarian history, we get stuck in that same way of thinking about our history. So if there's anything people can do, I think that's the thing to take
what
forward.
else can we learn in terms of these narratives that we're stuck in as well, which I've read a lot of Stan Grant trying to suggest different narratives around Australia Day. I mean, he wrote a book called Australia Day, very challenging for a First Nations person like Stan, as a good journalist, to attack it. And I read that book and I came away, the sentiment I got was, don't change the date, change the knowing and the knowledge. We've got these two divides that occur on the 26th of January, it's survival or invasion day. And I've participated in that this year to see, from the First Nations perspective, the anger that's still building there. And then there's the Australian Day, the Europeans, the Aussies that come out and put their flag on, and, an invasion day, it's around the flag. Writing 1787 was really a good sort of, like you were saying, we're getting all caught up about one moment, one day, that's not even really a truth in itself, but it is sort of a truth. It's the day this land was annexed, by the royal family, or on their representatives to take ownership. But it was already happening, and it was going to happen anyway, whether it was the British, my understanding, or the French, or the Portuguese or the Dutch. One of the aggressors was going to say, hey, we'll take this, thank you very much. It just happened to be the British. It must have been that window of time, that for them it was the right things were aligning for them. They'd been kicked out of the Americas and they needed a new place to bring their convicts, their prisoners, the bad people who are stealing stockings and bread. I think of my great-great-grandmother, her record in the Old Bailey is silk stockings and a silk handkerchief, and they have basically no value at all. And you wonder if she was actually sent over here to breed anyway, as part of the breeding policies, Who knows?
Well, what I'll say about this, I've done a considerable amount of research on Australia Day, which has not yet borne publication fruit, but we're still going. So what I will say about that is that Australia Day is a fascinating insight into a country's historical myopia, really. The significance of Australia Day demonstrably waxes and wanes over the 2 centuries after that moment that it ostensibly celebrates. In the first decade of colonial settlement, first 3 decades, in fact, it's not an important day at all. I'd say the reason that this, if you could nail it, the single most significant reason 26th of January becomes the day on which the colonisation of Australia is celebrated is because that's the day the Rum Rebellion occurs. And so,
oh my goodness,
that's the deposition of Governor Bligh by the military. And so when Lachlan Macquarie rocks up later, he makes a really big song and dance about Australia Day, about the First Fleet. And it's a way of whitewashing the complexities of European history. And so it's from there on that it starts to become a day of major celebration. And it's asserting the legitimacy of British government, not so much because of anything that happened in 1788, but because of the complexities between that and whatever date it's being celebrated on. And I think that dynamic persists now. That's why it's seen as a problematic national day, because it's not so much the day itself. 26th January is just any old day in a way. And its historical significance is next to nothing. The 26th of January 1788 is a day in which the ships moved from Botany Bay to Sydney Cove, and a few of them got out and raised a flag there. And okay, that has a symbolic import for Sydney, but they'd arrived in Botany Bay a few days earlier. It's not like that was the start of European colonisation of Australia. And the formalities of occupation took place after that. So they didn't take place on that day at all anyway. It's become symbolically important because of its links to Sydney as much as anything. But the day itself is of relatively minor significance. And you see later on that different states have sort of arguments about that. For Victorians and Western Australians and Tasmanians, until relatively recent times, Australia Day, as in 26th January, was not very significant for them. They looked to their own colonial starting points. So it's really as Australia's historical narrative developed and became distilled during the 20th century that day took on extraordinary significance. You see the same thing happen in 1888 with the centenary, basically because people want to have a centenary celebration. And then in 1988, the same thing happens then.
Fascinating. And all I'm going to say is I'm going to keep reading your books, and I'm hoping our listeners will continue to do that. I've got a lot of your books on our website. I've put in our Yarn Up page, it's all about recommendations. I've got part 1 recommendations, a whole series of books around Australia, some historical fiction, some historical non-fiction. And I've just put up another one called part 2. So I'm going to continue to add to that. So even as an author, you think, that'd be good for Greg to share. Always send me a note and say, look, that's something else to add to that, because I'd like it to grow up and be a bit of a resource that's looking at all the different perspectives. We'll also have in the migrants' perspective as that evolves. There's some really great history capturing, all of us, whether new or old, we're all migrants. But, those stories through, the Vietnamese coming, the Syrians, the Africans, the Congolese, and adding all of those stories in. So we get a true picture over time, or people can explore it, not just from one lens, but see the 3 lenses and try to make some sense of it themselves. But I really appreciate you coming on today. Now, with our podcast, of course, we are on all the platforms, Spotify, Apple, Google, Amazon. We're on YouTube as well. And you can see us at our website, www.walking3worlds.com.au. You can go to Nick's website as well. Nick, what's your domain again?
It's actually www.nicholasdeanbrodie.com, but if you just Google Nick Brodie...
it comes up, beautiful, and there's some really good information that you've got there, great resources, and I'll keep following you. I'm a big fan of yours now, so you're going to have me...
That's good. Thanks,
you're going to a Tasmanian following another, now new Tasmanian. I'm an old Tasmanian following a new. A lot of my friends up in Queensland have moved to Tassie, and I've got a lot of old friends down there. I was there my activity was in the 70s. I was in a band and we played at the West Point Casino for 6 months. We had a 6-month residency there. So I was very involved in the music scene. A lot of the musicians do know me, the older ones particularly. But I have it's funny, your heart is still there, but I've married a Queenslander and I've become a Queenslander, even though I don't follow the sport. But I do love the weather and I love the place. And Tassie still is a very fond memory for me. Mount Wellington, all those beautiful places. But Nick, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Anyone who wants to sort of tap into Nick, they're welcome to find him, explore his books. I highly recommend that. Thanks again, Nick, for joining us today.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.